It's my pleasure to welcome Kristy Platt, the Senior Project Officer, Community Media and Arts Program at the Hunter Institute of Mental Health, to provide an overview of promoting safe and responsible communication of suicide in the media and social media. Please join me in welcoming Kristy.
I'm just going to work out this mic. Thank you so much for having me. So, as we mentioned, I'm here from the Hunter Institute of Mental Health. We're an organisation based in Newcastle, and today we're going to be talking about suicide, supporting safe and responsible reporting of suicide. Hopefully today we can, you guys will leave here with an increased knowledge on our programs and mental health and mental illness and suicide, as well as a discussion around media's role in suicide prevention and some practical skills on working with the media. Now, I'm sure some of the other presenters, unfortunately I missed this morning, but other presenters would have mentioned it can be really draining to talk about suicide and suicide prevention all day, so do be kind to yourself. Go home tonight, and even if you are feeling well, we recommend take a bath or do something nice, enjoy a nice meal, but do look after yourself. And if for some reason you aren't feeling well at the end of the day, speak to a doctor, speak to someone you trust, or call one of the service lines here. So that's just really important. We've also got self-care resources on the Mindframe website, which I'll show you in a minute as well. So do access those, because this material can be quite full-on and draining. So as I mentioned, I work at the Hunter Institute of Mental Health. We're a leading national organisation dedicated to reducing mental illness and suicide and improving wellbeing for all Australians. We're a national program based in Newcastle, New South Wales. It's about 2 hours drive north of Sydney. And we are working with local, state and national programs. I have been working at the Institute for around 3.5 years, and my program manager, Mark, who's just left the room at the moment, has also been there about 7.5 years. My background, just so that you know, I was a journalist for around 8 years in Sydney. I have been working in media and comms for about 14 in total, and I also worked for the NHS in the UK in mental health for about 1.5 years. As I mentioned, here are our websites. So we've got the Hunter Institute of Mental Health is the first one. You might want to, if you want any more information on that or any of our other programs, please come and see me afterwards. We've also got the Mindframe Media program. Today, the Hunter Institute runs various programs. So Mindframe is one of them, which is what we're going to be covering today. The second one we're going to be touching on is called Conversations Matter, which I'll also go into in more detail. And 3 other of our main programs at the Institute are Responsibility, so that's preparing and supporting teachers and early childhood workers. We've also got Working Well, which is around supporting the mental health of mining communities. And our third one is the Partners in Depression program, so it's a 6-week program, but basically providing education and resources for people who are caring with other people experiencing depression. Please also feel free to follow us on Twitter, and we've got our two our 2 handles there. And the Institute, also has a Facebook page, but Mindframe doesn't. So that's some background on us. Today we're going to be talking about suicide in general. Just going to run through some rates and trends in Australia. It might be new to some of you, and some of you may already know all of this information. Then I'll be touching on the Mindframe National Media Initiative and Conversations Matter. As I mentioned, they're 2 of our main programs and the programs that I work across. I'll be talking through the risks and opportunities of media reporting suicide, and hopefully give you some tools on if you're needing to work with the media on how to do that safely and effectively. And that's basically what Mindframe is about, which I'm going to go into more detail. And with Conversations Matter, we'll be answering the question, how can we talk about suicide safely and effectively in communities? So, as I mentioned, the Mindframe National Media Initiative collaborates with the Australian media and other sectors to encourage the responsible, accurate and sensitive portrayal of mental illness and suicide. So this is the 18th year that we've run the Mindframe National Media Initiative, and we are funded under the Department of Health's National Suicide Prevention Program, but we also are managed by Hunter New England Health and obviously the Hunter Institute of Mental Health, so it's a bit of a mouthful explaining all of that. The main aims of our organisation are to promote suicide prevention and mental health promotion, reducing risks to audiences, and in that audiences would be more vulnerable audiences, which I'll explain in more detail, and decreasing stigma and discrimination associated with mental illness. Something we always point out in our training sessions and when speaking with the media is that we're not here to police the media and mental health organisations and suicide prevention organisations. We're here to provide support so that you can safely go about doing your job. Sometimes there's a myth that you shouldn't be reporting on suicide or people shouldn't be talking about it, and that is a myth. We actually want people to report on it, just do so safely, so without method or location, and adding helplines, and then just there's a few other details here. Australia are actually recognised by the World Health Organization as world leaders in the development and dissemination of media guidelines, and also in media reporting. We're actually a lot better than a lot of other countries, the UK and the US. I know you had Jane Perker speaking this morning. Unfortunately, I missed that, but she did, along with a few others, Professor Jane Perkis did the media monitoring studies in 2001 and 2007. So they found during that period, over the 6 years, there was an increase in reporting of suicide. So the media reported it more. They listened to the guidelines and said, yes, we want to be talking about this. And the quality increased 75.1%, I believe. So they were reporting it more, but doing it safely, leaving out method, leaving out location. So Australia are really, really good. Our media listen to us, but obviously there's still work to be done, which is why we exist. Just a little bit about our approach, how Mindframe in general works. So we work predominantly with the media sector, as I mentioned. We provide education and training. We go out to the cadet programs at, say, Fairfax, go out to SBS, ABC, news.com.au, all of the big organisations. We work really closely with them, provide hour or 2 hour long training sessions. We also have a media advisory group made up of members. I think we've got 20-something on there from each of these media organisations. That's the producers, the editors. On that, we've got an app which we encourage, which if anyone would like the link as well, but if you just look up Mindframe Media, we've got a fantastic media app with our resources on that. And we also have media resources in a booklet form and on our website. So quite a few ways we can get our information out to the media to support them to safely report on mental illness and suicide. Now, as well as working with the media, we work with other sectors who inform the media. So on the right here, you've got sources of information for journalists. The mental health and suicide prevention sectors, which I believe most people here would probably fit into somewhere. With that group, we have an advisory group made up of the comms managers and the CEOs from Suicide Prevention Australia. We've got Kim here, Mental Health Australia, and a lot of the as the peak bodies, and we've also got Beyond Blue, Reach Out, all of these guys informing the resources that we develop for that sector. Predominantly, we've got comms managers as well as CEOs in that group that we work with. And we also provide training to these sectors on the same thing. When they're contacted by media, what can they say, or what language is safer to use than perhaps what some sectors have been using in the past. We also work with police and courts, and it's the same kind of thing. Police are really engaged. They're often the first responders if, say, there's a suicide, so they're contacted by media, and the media want them to say something, and if they do this without thinking, they might end up with method and location all over the paper if the media is not aware of our guidelines. So the police actually have their own resources, reminding them of the same guidelines, and they've been really receptive to taking that up. And then over there on the right, we've got training of journalism and PR students. So again, we've got an advisory group of university lecturers from around Australia. I think every single university in Australia is represented and had some training at some stage. So we go in, they're basically the journalists and PR professionals of tomorrow. We go in there and we do our Mindframe training. We have online resources for them, and we're actually developing some online training so that we can reach further, because our organisation isn't big enough to obviously teach everyone all the time. And then stage and screen portrayals. So we've got film and TV script writers. We're in contact with the Australian Writers Guild, and we often get contacted for assistance around choosing the right language, or just accurately portraying someone with mental illness in say, Home and Away, those kind of programs. And we provide advice all the time. So they're basically the main sectors that we work with, and obviously the outcome that we want is improved media coverage of suicide and mental illness overall in Australia. So that's a little bit about us. Now, talking about suicide. So conversations matter. These are the second resources I will touch on today. They're resources for discussing suicide in a variety of settings. So that's individual conversations about suicide in workplaces, in educational settings, and we've got a wide range of they come in podcasts, fact sheets and online presentations, which are available on our website as well. So these resources basically support the safe and effective community discussions of suicide. We also offer training, Conversations Matter training. I recently did one at the University of Newcastle, training student leaders how to respond to someone, say a younger student or a newer student who came to them with suicidal ideation. So these can be really helpful for different settings. They aim to assist communities and professionals when they want to know how to talk about suicide, they're worried about someone and want to know what to say, and when there has been a death and they want to know how to handle having conversations. Does anyone have any questions so far? Any of the information?
Just one quick one.
Yep.
Did you give Conversations Matter newsletter that came out when it was first introduced?
I'm not sure. I was involved in some of the development, but there was definitely a Mindframe e-newsletter.
Yeah,
But
has that stopped?
no, it's just not as regular at the moment because there's been some staffing changes. But it's still, I think it's every 2 months. So if anyone is interested in signing up to that as well, either come and see me afterwards or you can email Mark or myself. We can certainly add you onto that when I tell you exactly what we're all about, for those of you who aren't sure. But yeah, good question. Does anyone else have any questions so far? No? Okay. So now I'm going to run through just some background data, I guess, about suicide rates in Australia. I'm probably speaking to an audience who may already know this, but just bear with me. I usually throw this out to the crowd and try to get you to guess how the rates are going, because people's perceptions are not always exactly as they appear, but with a large group I might just let you know what they are. So where we get this data from is the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They release their cause of death data each March, and Mindframe's got a fantastic relationship with them. So we, when that data comes in, we basically each year remind the media just to remember the Mindframe guidelines, keep them in mind before writing about statistics and kind of scaring the general public. So how much do we know about current rates of suicide in Australia? These are the preliminary rates from 2013. So as you see on the right, we've got the suicide rate per 100,000, and down the bottom we've got age category. Has anyone seen this graph before? Yeah, a couple of you nodding. I'll just run through it quickly anyway. So the male suicide rates are in blue and female are in red. And when I go out to train media organisations, a lot of people are surprised that, as you'll see here, 40 to 44-year-old males have the highest rates, apart from the 85 plus, which I'll touch on in a minute. Because the media seem to report on youth suicide a little bit more, people usually put up their hand and think that youth suicide rates are highest. With youth suicide, as many of you know, the highest cause of death for youth in that age bracket is suicide, because they're not dying of many other things like age-related diseases, heart attacks, that kind of thing. So while awful, the highest age category is 44 to, well, it's really 40 to 50, we generally say, males, which is probably why there's so much targeted work being done in the sector for this age group. With the 85 plus, there is a spike there, as you'll notice. From our research, we believe that that's because it's there's a smaller amount of people in that age bracket. So if there's say there's 10 extra suicides in 1 year, that can cause a spike. But we are still looking into why that is such a large spike. We also know that things like feeling like a burden and loneliness experienced by that age group are probably factors, but some of you actually might have more information on this than I do, but it's something that we are looking into more anyway. Does anyone have any questions about that slide? Want to add anything?
I've just got a question that might be completely wrong.
No, fantastic, go ahead.
You know, like you said that you're encouraging the media to report on suicide. I mean, that's what we want to do.
Yep.
We want to reduce the stigma and not mind that.
Yep.
It's not controversial because I've heard it said before, but why do we not carefully, under your framework, release the number of suicides per month or whatever, compared to the road, like we do it with the road toll, we have education around the road toll, etc., etc.
Why can't we do it?
Be worrying and fearful and everything, but
Yeah. So why not the road toll comparison? Is that what you mean?
Why don't we just have the number of suicides this month has been 250?
Because I think this is just it normalises, yeah. So it is still a very rare occurrence. I haven't got the exact number from last year, but I think it was 2,500 and something.
That's not a
There you go,
rare
35. It's a rare occurrence in that it's awful and it's still too much, but in the whole scheme of things with, you know what I mean, like with people dying of other things. So if people believe that it's normal, then other people, and if they hear story, I'll go into it in more detail, but
I
yeah.
think it's also to do with the strength of the data and how careful we are around using the data. So for example, this month the new stats will be released.
Yeah, and the road toll is an interesting one because we do say, with the comparison with the road toll, some organisations have said before we want to kind of start with look how much higher road toll suicides are compared to road toll. But I think it's about rather than alarming the community, we want to alert them to things, but it can be more helpful to provide hopeful messages, or there's a lot of other ways where you can actually be more help for the community and put help seeking. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask about your terminology. You said it normalises suicide. Now we've been exposed to car accident rates. That doesn't normalise car accidents.
But it doesn't cause other people to have more car accidents if you talk about car accidents, where if you're talking about suicide, I will cover it in a little bit. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
That's okay.
Can I also, this is one issue that we found. I love the Mindframe guidelines. I think
Thanks,
it's such
Dominic.
a valuable resource for journos. But in terms of trying to, this sort of, as someone who loves getting media, I also find sometimes the messages of hope, whilst important, they're not going to get the media story. And so one of the things, and we haven't been told off by Mindframe, maybe I will
Keep going.
is highlight the significance of the issue in a bold way, but then offer the hope and solution around that more newsworthy language. So the framework. So it's like so we've gone out there quite publicly and said, look, it's an actual emergency, double the road toll, but it's an actual emergency we can do something about. We've got programs, we've got services, initiatives, we've got ideas. It's not something that we've got scratching our heads and we've got no idea what to do about. So I don't know, that's just one way that we've looked at it.
And I think that, like I mentioned at the start, we're not here to police people, so you can kind of, we can just provide the information and the evidence base, which I'm going to touch on a little bit, but it's up to you guys to do what you feel you need to, and I guess we're all learning as we go as well. So, but yeah, we'll probably have a conversation more later. But yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's a tricky one to kind of manoeuvre. It's probably more important, obviously, that you don't put method and location than to compare with a road toll. It's all of this kind of prioritising, but we're getting there. Did you, one more question? Sorry to ask a question.
Comment that there's a reported suicide rate, so that the rate is actually quite a lot higher.
Yeah, I might actually show you the next slide because it goes on to elaborate more. Oh, sorry, you're talking about ones that aren't reported, yeah.
Yeah, and also that at any given time, if you've got a room of 20 people, there could be a couple of people out of 20 who are thinking about suicide.
Yeah.
So it is a normal phenomenon.
It definitely is. I think I worded that badly before when I said
it's a good point,
normalising.
I was just sort of thinking, well, part of what you do as a suicide trainer is to sort of make it normal so people can sort of say, I'm not afraid.
Yes.
If I think about this, there's nothing weird about me. It's a normal human thing to think.
Yeah.
But not many people go on to act on it. There's also a lot of people who act and don't die as well. So the magnitude of the problem is actually a lot bigger than...
It is, and we're really only talking about the media here, not general public. So with the training, I probably will mention method and things like that, and that's why we're very careful at the start and the end to kind of remind people about self-care. Yeah. With the media, there are, I'm going to go on, I probably shouldn't ask questions in the middle because I go on to explain them all. No, that's okay. But it's the vulnerable members of the public that we're worried about. So they're the people that we put all these safeguards in place for. It's not the general public, but I might save all questions for the end, just to, in case I do cover it. So with the stat, which Damon's just answered, but the suicide trends in this country is the problem getting worse. Often I get people in the media saying, yes, definitely getting worse. We're reporting on it more. So it may be interesting to see that it's actually quite stable for rates at the moment, we definitely want it to be zero. I guess that's what I hopefully am getting across, but I'm just painting the picture as it is at the moment. So over the last, say from 1989 to 2013, it is, the rates have not gone up, as some people seem to believe, but they are definitely too high. That black line there is the Australian Bureau of Statistics began including coronial suicides ruled as a death by coronial inquest, which, as you mentioned, could take, say, 18 months, 2 years to be recorded. So from 2005, the data is more accurate. It's got that second blue, the blue line on the top, and the black line is what it would have been if it was not including coronial suicides by coronial inquest. As you can see again, male suicide rates are consistently higher than women. And there's also a drop from the late 90s. We believe that's because in the late 90s, the World Health Organization began encouraging governments to implement national suicide prevention programs like the one that Mindframe comes under. And there's also been an increase in support services like Headspace, Beyond Blue, all those kind of services. So things have hopefully improved and will continue improving. So that's some statistics. So when we're talking about suicide, I'm sure all of you will definitely agree on this one, it's an important issue of community concern that we need to be talking about. However, there's sometimes confusion about what is meant by discussing or talking about suicide and also the evidence. So I think one of the other presenters earlier mentioned there's some confusion around if I talk about suicide with someone or if I raise a subject, is that going to plant the idea in their head? I think it was actually Jo, and she mentioned that research has been done and that's not going to happen. There's enough anecdotal evidence now that that's probably not going to happen. So it's about getting that conversation started and as a sector being the people to start that conversation so that other people are empowered as well. We need to ensure we are not too afraid to talk about suicide, but while also understanding and respecting the risks, which is what we're going to be covering today. So what we know that talking to someone about suicide will not increase the suicide risk, which is what we just mentioned. We also know that media reporting of suicide deaths has been associated with increased risk for those who are already vulnerable. To explain that one, Mindframe National Media Initiative is based on an evidence base of more than 100 international studies saying this much. There's also something known as the Werther effect, which is derived from, I think it was Goethe's book, The Sorrows of Young Werther, which explains basically media's effect on suicide rates. So when The Sorrows of Young Werther was released in 1774, there was an increase in suicide, and they actually went on to ban the book in many European states. So for some time they have known about this, it's just that we're all continuing to do research and making sure that we can put these safeguards in place. What we don't know still is that whether or not conversations or more general media reporting about suicide will increase or decrease risk. We hope that we'll decrease risk if just reporting about suicide and suicide prevention, but it's just something that hasn't yet been studied. And it probably would be good to have Jo here to set something in motion, but yeah. So I mentioned before, there's 4 audiences that Mindframe look at when looking at the media reporting of suicide. The first group is those who are not affected or not interested in any stories about suicide. So they're the people flicking through the paper. Even though they're on there as not interested, it's still important to have the piece in the paper because it might challenge their misconceptions or increase understanding. So they're still an important group. The second group is some level of interest. So they're the people who maybe someone in their family has, or someone they know has come to them with suicidal ideation at some point. It can be useful for them to read these kind of articles because it can provide support lines and they can pass that information on later. Then we've got our vulnerable at-risk group. So those are the people that are either experiencing suicidal ideation or are unwell. And they're our target group when we talk about the guidelines. So that's really important. While we don't discount the general public, we are certainly catering for this group. And the bereaved also fall into this group because the bereaved are actually classified as an at-risk group themselves at times. So that's important to remember. So the impact of media reporting on suicide. Reporting about suicide deaths has been associated, as we mentioned, with increased rates of suicide and suicide attempts, using the same method or location and increased rates of suicide overall. we've got a few good examples on our website of, for example, when rail suicides occurred in Italy, and they reported on them and the rates went up quite dramatically, and then they stopped reporting on them. So if anyone wants more information on those, I can certainly have a chat at the end. And then people vulnerable to suicide may be drawn to stories about suicide and negatively impacted by these. The way I like to describe this one is, I used to be a journalist many years ago. When I was a health journalist, I'd be flicking through the paper and I'd look for stories on health. So if there's something, if I see an apple, an image, or the word health, they're the stories I wanted to read as research. Unfortunately, when people are not feeling well, they're also looking for a way out. They're drawn to stories about suicide. So if suicide's in the headline or there's details in there, they're the stories they're going to be reading. And that's why the Mindframe guidelines are so important. So risk generally increases when reporting details, method and location. I've got another little anecdote about a location that was used, which hopefully will help you remember this one. There was a city in Australia, I won't name which city. A man went to a car park and took his life. The next day the local newspaper reported it, and they put in all of the details. So they would have gone to a mental health professional, suicide prevention professional, or someone in the area, got this information. They said he went through these stairs, he went to this level, he jumped off there. 3 days later, someone took their life in identical way, so copied the exact method and location. But there was an identical car park across the road, and they didn't use that car park. The reason this story stands out for me particularly is that it shows that the person's not feeling well, they're vulnerable at the time, they're looking for something that works. So that's why that car park was used. And it's just one story and it's one anecdote, but it kind of brings things home for me. Reporting that sensationalises suicide can also increase risk. So I'm talking more in case you guys are, got your local organisations and you're going to be contacted by media and how to provide stories. So you can only do so much. You can advise them and give them certain details, but it's up to the media reporter at the end of the day how they're going to report on it. So this sensationalised suicide is the one around using stories to alert the public but not alarm them. So facts and stats, as I mentioned, can sometimes be alarming to people and normalise the behaviour, I think. And also facts and stats, and also words like suicide epidemic. People think it's an epidemic, I'm going to catch it. It's that kind of thing. Rather than that, there's, I'll give you some slides on language later, but there's a few other examples that you can use. When stories are prominent and repeated, again, this is more for media than you guys, but you can always remind media of the Mindframe guidelines. So if a story is first up front on the paper, or there's a few stories in a row, that can also normalise suicide. And when they focus on an individual who has died, especially celebrities. So if someone's feeling vulnerable and they identify with the celebrity and they've used a certain method, it's usually if there's a couple of these in a row in the one story that there can be issues. So we generally advise media to report on the celebrity death because it's in the public interest, but try to leave method or location out of it. And finally, when it glamorises or glorifies the death. So if it's painting suicide as a way out of problems. Here's a little bit more details on method and location. So we've got the Robin Williams death there, the coroner increased preliminary findings. So they were quite well. Australian media is quite good. It's the international media that we sometimes have to worry about, but Australian media is certainly getting a lot better. So reporting on method, we advise if it is needed for a story, or if you do really want to tell a journalist these details, leave out the description of the medication or the quantity, because those are the details that can be damaging to vulnerable audiences. Just say something like a cocktail of drugs, and yeah, not the type and quantity. Leave out specific details about unusual methods. One method that had never been used before in Hong Kong, it was, without saying what it was using a substance, basically burning a substance that had never been used before. One woman used it to take her life. The media reported on it. 3 months later, it was the second most common method used in Hong Kong, and it still remains quite a common method. So if it's unusual and people don't know about it, leave it as an unusual method. And describe location in general terms only, like the car park story. Just say at a nearby park, and avoid use of graphic or dramatic photographs or footage when you can. So I also look after the social media guidelines we're writing, which I kind of touched on, mentioned before. Unfortunately, with social media, it's its own little entity. Quite a prominent newspaper put on their social media photos of a man standing on a ledge thinking about taking his life the other day. So that kind of stuff, even though they know the Mindframe guidelines and they're actually usually really, really good, social media is usually managed by another person in that organisation. So it's just a whole nother kettle of fish for us to start contacting, because if people see that location, that method, and then that person does take their life, it has the same risks as with the media. So as I mentioned before, we've got some language. One that's not on there is things like, you've probably heard teenagers say, oh, I was so embarrassed I could have killed myself. That's pretty common knowledge. Unfortunately, it's not great, but imagine you're listening to that teenager and you've just lost a brother to suicide. That can make you feel, it can be quite upsetting for you and make you feel quite alone. So here's some other examples of language that, that we've got some problematic but also preferred. So with the media, you've probably seen things like successful suicide or committed suicide. That's I often see that one. The first one presents suicide as a desired outcome, and the second one associates the suicide with crime or sin, which is obviously quite outdated. So we prefer people to use words like took their own life for both of those. And if we start using this language in our everyday, we're obviously training the media, but if we can start using this in everyday, we as a sector can pass that information on to others and hopefully make some change. We've got language that glamorises a suicide, so failed suicide. We prefer make an attempt on his life. We've got phrases that sensationalise suicide. As I mentioned, suicide epidemic. It's not an epidemic. We can just use words like higher rates, increasing rates. And finally, suicide being used out of context. So suicide mission, political suicide. We advise not using that. Again, we're not here to police you, but we can provide information. The media's role in suicide prevention is to decrease risk. It can be helpful to provide some context. So suicide is usually not the event that happens after one. It's not the one event that causes a suicide. It's usually a very complex thing, and so should be framed as such in the paper. There are often many factors which come into play when someone takes their life. So if the newspaper just is too simple with their explanations, then that can make it sound like it's just the result of one factor. Framing suicide as tragic and avoidable can decrease risk, because as we know, many suicides are preventable. Focus on the negative impact, so increasing understanding of suicide in the community. Exploring overcoming suicidal ideation. So as I mentioned a few times, promoting stories of hope and recovery can be really, really helpful for anyone experiencing suicidal ideation that looks through that paper. Rather than reading details of a death, if they see someone recovering, that can be more helpful for those vulnerable audiences. And promoting help-seeking information. When I was a journalist, that was the first thing I always knew to do at the end of a story, put 2 help-seeking services on there, and that's something our media do quite well, but it's important for you guys to also do that when speaking with the media. And this is quite similar, but just some of the helpful messages, increasing understanding of risk factors and warning signs. So that can also be useful for when you're speaking with newspapers. Information about social and emotional wellbeing, as I've just mentioned, stories of hope and recovery, and information about support. That's quite similar to the last one. And the reason we're using these helpful messages is to improve community understanding, correct myths and stereotypes, reduce the fear, shame and stigma. As I mentioned, suicide was a sin and was a crime, so if we stop using the words committed, that can take some of that stigma away. Increase understanding of the challenges experienced by someone living with a mental illness or caring for someone with a mental illness, and encouraging people to seek help. Now, I mentioned again, we are developing some social media guidelines. So these guidelines are a little bit different to the clinical based guidelines that some of the other services are working on. These are going to be safe. They're promoting the safe, accurate and effective discussion of suicide, self-harm and mental illness on online settings. So that's websites, forums and social media is going to be a huge one. We're going to be releasing our suicide guidelines for media and communication professionals in May this year. We've actually got an advisory group, which I'll touch on in a minute. And as I mentioned, Australian media professionals and communication practitioners are our two key sectors to start with. We've also been working with some social media organisations, so in the next 3 years we're going to broaden these guidelines and develop targeted education and training for social media organisations to help monitor what we're doing here today. Now, these guidelines are informed by an in-house Mindframe literature review. They're also a social media advisory group, so there's a few members here today on that. The advisory group is made up of media, so we've got all the major media organisations, ABC, news.com.au, Australian Press Council, which run their own set of guidelines and we work very closely with, and they have guidelines around suicide that we basically wrote. So as well as the media organisations, there's about 7 of those. We've got the mental health suicide prevention sector, so we've got Mental Health Australia, Suicide Prevention Australia, Kim, I think we've got Lifeline on there. We've also got Beyond Blue, Reach Out, Headspace, all of these guys, and Griffith University is our university sector representative. And then we've also got quite a lot of data. So we co-hosted a Young and Well social media roundtable a couple of years ago. So we've got that information as well as some scoping studies we did with an outside provider, a summary report, 3 thematic analyses from advisory groups we've had with for all of our different sectors. And that's basically what's going to be informing, as well as just ad hoc conversations with people around what is needed. So some of the information from today will probably end up in that. These guidelines are going to be including safe and effective promotion and online engagement and duty of care. So these two, I guess, to start with, when you're on Facebook, you've seen the About page. We encourage people to, whether in the media or the mental health sector, to try and not become accidental counsellors if that's not your role. So we're going to be encouraging putting in hours of moderation, writing, this is not a clinical service if you're not a clinical service, and providing helplines to the services who can help vulnerable people who may be coming to your site. And that's around duty of care and looking after yourself as the person moderating that page. There's a moderation of open and closed forums. So with media, you may see news stories, and if there's a story about suicide and they open up the comments, it can just open up a whole can of worms. A lot of it's useful, but it can also be harmful to people, some of the things that are written on there. And if someone's not moderating those 24/7, or if they're not a clinician and they don't know to report them to send the person on to a health service, then that can be a little bit dangerous. Then obviously suicide prevention and mental health promotion messaging. So a lot of that is similar to the other Mindframe guidelines around promoting stories of hope and recovery on social media pages as well as in the media. And other Mindframe principles. So that just goes back to, with social media, sometimes you add your own little story. Try not to put method or location in that. I don't think anyone here would, but that's going to be on the guidelines, and just adding helplines information. And just as some background to the guidelines, we already know that the media and the mental health and suicide prevention sectors are engaged on social media. Some of the media professionals in Australia are celebrities in their own right. They have huge followings, and that's something we definitely have been taking into consideration. We also consider the way that social media is two-way communication. So in the past, formal traditional media was only one way. You read a story and you didn't have a place to comment, but now it's two-way. There's a lot of user-generated content. The live logging of events is something we've been needing to consider. And international media, and with the second one, they're different reporting standards. So Mindframe's obviously across Australian media as much as we can be, and hopefully we'll continue to increase that, but international media are not abiding by the same guidelines, or are not, they're not identical. So sometimes there might be a story with 3 methods throughout the story, and it's picked up by an Australian news source. So Yahoo might publish something that's been in an international media organisation, and it's about managing that and working with government organisations and media organisations to make sure that we continue to provide safe and effective communication. So just to sum up, supporting the media is essential in suicide prevention, and as social media continues to grow, so must the sector, which includes research. Reminder to look after yourself. As I mentioned at the start, this can be quite distressing. Probably the whole day could be quite distressing for some people. Talk to a friend, do something you enjoy, contact a doctor or one of the services just if you want to speak to anyone. Our website's there, the himh.org.au. We have various other programs, so I know that there's different people from different sectors in here, so if any of the others are of interest, please get in touch. That's it. Thank you for having me.